Hey there, tonight we're going to dive deep into one of the harshest and most fascinating periods in history, the Mongol Empire under the rule of Genghis Khan. Imagine waking up and realizing you have to live through this. A day in the Mongol Empire is no walk in the park. Between brutal weather conditions, constant wars, and a society built on survival of the fittest, you might wonder if you'd even make it through the day. Well, let's see what you'd face. Before we start, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy the content I'm creating here. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from, so drop your local time and place in the comments. Alright, now let's turn off the lights, maybe keep the fan on for some background noise, and let's walk through the night's journey together. Genghis Khan, born Temujin, wasn't just any leader. He transformed the Mongol people from a scattered group of nomads into one of the most formidable empires in history. The Mongol Empire stretched across vast swathes of land, from China to Eastern Europe, dominating everything in its path. But, as you can imagine, living in such an empire wasn't exactly easy, especially not for the average person. The first thing you'd face is the extreme climate. The Mongol steppe is known for its freezing winters, with temperatures plunging to 40-degree Celsius. Imagine living in these conditions without the luxury of modern heating or insulated homes. The only thing keeping you warm might be the furs of the animals you hunted, or the thin walls of your yurt, a type of tent used by the Mongols. Those would hardly stand up to the cold that would freeze your breath as soon as you stepped outside. On top of that, there's the constant threat of warfare. The Mongols didn't sit around waiting for things to happen. They went out and made them happen. Led by Genghis Khan, they were masters of psychological warfare, using tactics designed to scare the living daylights out of their enemies. But while the Mongols were fiercely smart and efficient in battle, the everyday life of a Mongol warrior wasn't as glamorous as you might imagine. To survive, you'd have to be in top physical condition, constantly moving, riding horses for hours on end, and dealing with both the exhaustion of endless travel and the threat of violence at every corner. As a member of this brutal society, you wouldn't be allowed to sit back and relax. Your day would likely start with a grueling training session. If you were a warrior, that meant getting on horseback, honing your archery skills, or sharpening your fighting abilities. If you weren't cut out for that life, you wouldn't last long. The Mongols had no room for weakness. If you couldn't keep up, you were either left behind or discarded. There was no sympathy for the slow or the weak. Everything you did would be for the sake of survival, and that meant keeping your skills sharp, staying alert, and always being prepared for battle. The Mongol military system was designed to move fast and fight hard. Genghis Khan's army could travel great distances in a short amount of time, living off the land and striking with deadly efficiency. If you were part of that army, you'd find yourself marching across endless plains, dodging enemy attacks, and maybe even fighting at a moment's notice. There was no off switch, and rest was rare. You'd be spending nights in the cold, out in the open, always alert, never knowing if an enemy raid was coming at any given moment. What might surprise you about the Mongols, though, is how strategic Genghis Khan was. Sure, they were brutal fighters, but they also had brains to back it up. One of the most famous strategies employed by Genghis Khan was to scare his enemies into surrendering without a fight. He would create a false impression of the Mongol army's size and strength, using deception to trick his opponents into thinking they were about to be overwhelmed. The Mongols didn't just rely on brute force. They used their wits to win battles before they even began. Historians still debate whether Genghis Khan invented psychological warfare, but there's no denying he was one of the earliest to make it a key part of military strategy. While his army was trained to be vicious and relentless in battle, they were equally effective at making their opponents feel powerless. This ability to use fear and manipulation made Genghis Khan's forces terrifying and it helped them take control of vast territories across Asia and Europe. But even if you survived a day in Genghis Khan's army, it wouldn't guarantee safety or comfort. The Mongol Empire was not a place where weakness could be tolerated. Even if you were a skilled warrior, you would always be on edge, always aware of the fact that you could die at any moment. Life was harsh and the stakes were high. Each battle could be your last, and if you were lucky enough to survive one, you'd have to prepare for the next. The Mongol way was all about resilience, and living in this world meant living with constant danger, always adapting to a world where everything could change in an instant. So can you imagine yourself surviving a day in this world? It's one thing to read about it, but to live it, that's a whole different story. Every day would be a struggle to stay alive, a battle against both the elements and the brutality of warfare. You would need to stay sharp, be prepared to fight, and never let your guard down. And even then, there would be no guarantee that you would make it through. Welcome back. Now that you've gotten a taste of what life might look like under Genghis Khan's rule, let's dive deeper into what a typical day in the Mongol Empire really felt like. Imagine it. You're living in an empire that spans vast stretches of land, from the steppes of Mongolia to the deserts of Central Asia, and even reaching parts of Europe. The world is yours to conquer, but for you, as an everyday person, life is anything but glamorous. In the Mongol Empire, the concept of home was foreign. The Mongols were nomads, moving constantly in search of new lands to conquer, new resources and new battles. If you were born into this world, you'd be used to never staying in one place for too long. Your home would be a yurt, a portable tent made of felt, easy to assemble and tear down as the Mongols traveled across the land. A yurt might sound comfortable, but in the brutal Mongol winters it was anything but. You would rely on the warmth of animals and maybe some woolen blankets, but the harsh, freezing temperatures would be inescapable. There were no heating systems or modern comforts, just the bare necessities to keep you alive. As a Mongol warrior, your day would start early, and not with luxury, but with work. You'd wake up to the chill of the early morning air, saddle up your horse, and get ready to face another day of hard labor. Horses were everything in Mongol society. Without them, you wouldn't survive. The Mongols used horses for everything: transport, communication, and of course, warfare. Imagine riding through rough terrain, your horse galloping through the plains, carrying you over great distances. The Mongol warriors were known for their stamina and speed, riding for hours without rest, making quick strikes against enemy forces and moving with incredible efficiency. But what's truly extraordinary is how Genghis Khan transformed this lifestyle into a machine of war. His army was not only strong but well organized. Every soldier was expected to be a skilled horseman, capable of fighting on horseback and maintaining discipline even in the most brutal conditions. And with every raid, every battle, the Mongols would carve their name deeper into history, striking fear into the hearts of their enemies. At the heart of Genghis Khan's strategy was a belief that war was not just about brute force, it was about the right timing, the right strategy, and the right psychological manipulation. Genghis Khan was a brilliant strategist who knew that in order to defeat an opponent, you had to break their spirit first. One of the key ways he did this was through fear. If you were an enemy of the Mongols, you'd likely never see them coming. Their military tactics were based on creating confusion and terror. They used tactics like feigned retreats, where they would pretend to be defeated in one battle, only to turn around and ambush their opponents when they least expected it. You'd be living in a constant state of alertness, knowing that a Mongol army could appear at any moment, swiftly descending upon your city. The fear of the Mongols was so widespread that many cities would surrender without even fighting, simply at the mention of Genghis Khan's name. This psychological warfare was as powerful as any sword or arrow, and it made the Mongols nearly unstoppable. But while the Mongols were vicious warriors, it wasn't all about warfare. Genghis Khan understood that his empire needed more than just soldiers. It needed infrastructure, communication, and organization. He set up a complex system of messengers, known as the Yam system, that could carry messages across thousands of miles with incredible speed. The Mongols could communicate almost instantaneously across their vast empire, a key factor in their success. You'd be a part of a vast network of people, all working toward one goal: survival, conquest, and the glory of the Mongol Empire. However, as much as Genghis Khan valued strategy, his empire wasn't just about conquest. It was also about ensuring the survival and prosperity of the Mongol people. His system of meritocracy meant that individuals were promoted based on ability, not birthright. If you could fight, if you could serve the empire, you would rise through the ranks. That was the way of the Mongols. It didn't matter where you came from. All that mattered was what you could do for the empire. But this system wasn't without its flaws. Life as a Mongol warrior was harsh. You didn't have the luxury of a stable life, a family, or time for personal pursuits. Everything was about the empire. Your family, your friends, your own desires, they all took a back seat to the Mongol cause. The constant movement, the lack of a permanent home, and the pressures of war meant that most Mongols had to sacrifice a lot just to survive. And yet, as difficult as life in the Mongol Empire could be, it was also one of the most organized and successful empires in history. Genghis Khan built an empire that lasted for centuries, and in the process, he left a lasting impact on the world. His empire facilitated trade along the Silk Road, brought about cultural exchanges between East and West, and reshaped the map of the known world. So, what would life be like for you if you lived in this world? If you were a member of Genghis Khan's Mongol army, you'd spend your days in constant motion, your nights under the stars, and your heart set on conquest. You'd be expected to fight with all your might, to follow orders without question, and to do whatever it took to survive. The world around you would be a place of constant change, where life and death were intertwined, and where only the strongest could survive. Could you live like this? Could you survive in the harsh, brutal world of Genghis Khan's Mongol Empire? That's the real question. The reality is, not everyone would make it. But if you had the resilience, the courage, and the sheer will to survive, maybe, just maybe, you could live another day in this unforgiving world. Now that you've experienced a taste of what living in Genghis Khan's world could be like, let's dive deeper into the unforgiving nature of life under his rule. This wasn't a world where the weak survived. Every day was a test of strength, intelligence, and loyalty. If you were a Mongol warrior, you would live with the constant pressure of survival, and even the smallest mistake could be your last. The Mongol Empire, unlike most others at the time, was built on the idea of merit. In Genghis Khan's eyes, it didn't matter where you came from. What mattered was your ability to fight, to think, and to serve the empire. The Mongols didn't have a rigid class system. Anyone could rise through the ranks, but only if they proved themselves. You'd have to prove your worth, day in and day out. If you couldn't handle the physical demands of a warrior, you wouldn't last. If you didn't follow orders or failed in a battle, the consequences were harsh, and failure often meant death. The training was relentless. As a Mongol warrior, you would be expected to be skilled in a range of activities: horseback riding, archery, and combat. The Mongols were famous for their ability to shoot arrows while riding at full speed. This skill was honed from a young age. As a child, you would likely spend hours riding and learning how to shoot accurately while in motion, making you one of the most effective warriors in history. But the reality was that this constant training wasn't just about physical strength. It was also about mental fortitude. Imagine waking up each morning knowing that the day would bring yet another long ride across the plains, a long stretch of endless travel with no guarantee of comfort or safety. The harsh landscape of the Mongol steppes would provide little shelter from the elements, and you would have to find ways to adapt. During the summer, the heat could be unbearable, while the winter would be freezing and brutal, but no matter the weather, you would keep moving. There was no time for rest, no time for weakness. You'd eat what you could find or what was provided, typically simple rations like dried meat, milk, and some grains. Luxury was not a word that existed in the Mongol language, but what the Mongols lacked in comfort, they made up for with strength, adaptability, and an unbreakable spirit. Even though the Mongol military was organized and disciplined, it was still dangerous. The Mongols had an army made up of tens of thousands of warriors, and each warrior had a specific role. You would find yourself constantly adjusting to different positions, being on the move, and quickly responding to any situation that arose. Every battle was fought with deadly precision, and you would have to know how to work as part of a team to succeed. But the real challenge of living under Genghis Khan's empire wasn't just the physical strain, it was the emotional toll. Life in this empire was built around loyalty and sacrifice. If you were a part of the Mongol army, you would have no choice but to submit to Genghis Khan's authority. His word was law, and his judgment was final. If you failed him, there would be consequences. The Mongols were known for their brutal treatment of traitors and disobedient soldiers, and being on the wrong side of Genghis Khan could mean a swift and merciless end. However, the loyalty that was demanded from each warrior also meant that you would find yourself in a community of equals, bound together by the shared goal of expanding and preserving the empire. The Mongols were one of the first empires to truly embrace a meritocratic system, where soldiers were rewarded based on their abilities and accomplishments rather than their birthright. If you fought well and showed courage in battle, you would be promoted, and if you survived long enough, you could rise to the top of the Mongol hierarchy. But survival in this world was never guaranteed. The Mongols faced constant warfare, and each victory was followed by another battle. For Genghis Khan's warriors, there was no time to relax. Even in times of peace, there was always the risk of another uprising, another invasion, or another enemy that would need to be defeated. The empire was always expanding, and with each new territory, there were new threats to conquer. You would be constantly on alert, prepared for the next campaign. The Mongols were relentless in their pursuit of power, and every warrior had to be ready to fight at a moment's notice. Even in the middle of the night, a battle could break out. The Mongols trained to fight with unwavering focus, always prepared for the next challenge. But it wasn't just about the battles. It was about the psychological toll that came with being part of this relentless army. The fear of failure would weigh heavily on your mind. Would you be strong enough to survive the next battle? Would you be able to keep your mind sharp enough to follow orders without hesitation? The pressure to succeed would constantly haunt you, and the threat of failure would always be present. But in the end, that was the world of the Mongols, a world where only the strong survived, where only the most loyal and most capable were rewarded, and where every warrior fought not just for their life, but for the glory of the empire. The Mongols may have been fierce conquerors, but they were also a product of their environment, shaped by the brutal realities of their world. So could you survive in this world? Could you face the daily grind of constant warfare, endless travel, and unyielding discipline? Could you live in an empire where failure meant death and loyalty was everything? If you were a Mongol warrior, you'd have to be more than just strong. You'd need the mental toughness to handle everything life threw at you. By now you've seen how brutal and unforgiving life was in the Mongol Empire. But surviving under Genghis Khan's rule wasn't just about enduring the physical hardships. it was also about mastering the complex and often ruthless strategies that made the Mongol military so effective. Genghis Khan wasn't just a great warrior, he was a brilliant strategist who understood that war was about much more than brute force. It was about deception, psychological warfare, and using every advantage to secure victory. When you lived in the Mongol Empire, you had to constantly be aware of your surroundings, understanding that every decision you made could affect the outcome of a battle. One of the most critical aspects of Mongol warfare was their use of speed and surprise. The Mongol army was known for moving faster and farther than any other army of the time. You'd spend days riding across endless landscapes, sometimes in extreme heat or freezing cold, always moving forward with precision and speed. The Mongols could cover large distances rapidly, giving them the element of surprise and making it nearly impossible for their enemies to keep up. But speed alone wouldn't make an army successful. Genghis Khan understood that the mental and psychological aspects of warfare were just as important as the physical ones. That's where his use of psychological warfare came into play. The Mongols were notorious for creating fear and panic among their enemies before they even engaged in battle. Imagine the terror of knowing that a Mongol army was heading your way, but having no idea where or when they would strike. This constant uncertainty made it nearly impossible for enemies to defend themselves effectively. One of Genghis Khan's most famous tactics was the feigned retreat. In a feigned retreat, the Mongols would pretend to be retreating, luring their enemies into a vulnerable position, and then suddenly turn around and attack. It was a tactic built on deception, and it worked wonders. It was a strategy that kept enemies off balance, never knowing if the Mongols were about to engage in battle or if they were trying to lure them into a trap. This ability to manipulate the battlefield and control the flow of combat was a key part of the Mongol military's success. But Genghis Khan's strategies weren't just limited to battle, he also understood the importance of communication and coordination. The Mongols used a vast network of messengers to relay information quickly across the empire. The famous Mongol postal system, called the Yam, was a series of relay stations that allowed messages to travel across thousands of miles at incredible speed. If you were part of the Mongol military, you'd likely be involved in some form of this network, whether you were a messenger carrying orders or a warrior using these messages to coordinate your next move. This efficient communication system allowed Genghis Khan to maintain control over his vast empire and military forces. It was essential for organizing campaigns, issuing commands, and ensuring that every part of the empire was working together. It also meant that the Mongols could strike quickly and with precision, as they could mobilize their forces at a moment's notice. Another key aspect of Genghis Khan's military genius was his ability to adapt and learn from his enemies. Unlike many rulers of the time, he didn't view his enemies as simply obstacles to be crushed. Instead, he saw them as opportunities to learn and improve. If a particular battle strategy or tactic worked against the Mongols, Genghis Khan was quick to adapt and use it for his own purposes. He was not afraid to incorporate new ideas, whether from other cultures or from his own experiences, to make his military even more effective. For example, the Mongols initially struggled with siege warfare, as their traditional tactics were built around speed and mobility. However, Genghis Khan quickly realized that in order to conquer heavily fortified cities, the Mongols needed to learn how to conduct sieges, so he brought in engineers and experts from different cultures, including the Chinese, who were already skilled in siege warfare. The Mongols learned how to build and operate siege machines like catapults and trebuchets, giving them the ability to breach even the most heavily fortified cities. This adaptability and willingness to learn from others set Genghis Khan apart from many other leaders of the time. He wasn't just building an empire through conquest, he was constantly improving the systems and strategies that allowed his empire to thrive. But it wasn't just about military strategies. Genghis Khan understood that a strong empire required strong leadership. His ability to unite a diverse group of people from different cultures and backgrounds was another key to his success. The Mongol Empire was not a homogeneous society. It was made up of many different ethnic groups, each with their own languages, customs, and traditions. Genghis Khan, however, was able to bring these people together, forging alliances with people who would have otherwise been his enemies. This unity was built on mutual respect and loyalty. Genghis Khan was known for rewarding those who served him well, regardless of their background. He was a ruler who believed in promoting people based on their abilities, not their social status. If you were a skilled warrior, you could rise through the ranks no matter where you came from. This meritocratic system helped create a sense of unity among the diverse peoples of the Mongol Empire, allowing them to work together toward a common goal. But even with all of Genghis Khan's genius, life under his rule was still harsh. You would still be living in constant fear, never knowing when the next battle might come or when the next challenge might arise. Even if you were lucky enough to be promoted, the demands of the empire would still weigh heavily on you. Every day would be a reminder that survival in the Mongol world was never guaranteed. So how would you fare in this unforgiving empire? Could you survive the pressure of Genghis Khan's military strategies and the constant mental strain of living under his rule? Could you adapt to the harsh realities of the Mongol way of life? For most, it would be impossible. But if you had the strength, the courage, and the cunning to survive, you might just make it through another day in the Mongol Empire. As we continue our journey into the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan, we must also look at the other side of survival. What happens once you've managed to make it through the brutal realities of this world? In the Mongol Empire, there was little room for complacency. You weren't just fighting for survival, you were fighting for your place in the empire. Your worth was defined by your actions, and rewards as well as consequences came swiftly. If you could keep up with the pace, prove your worth in battle, and demonstrate unwavering loyalty to Genghis Khan, your life would be one of incredible opportunity and respect. But fail, and it could mean your downfall. After surviving countless battles, exhausting journeys, and the unrelenting grind of daily life, you might begin to earn rewards for your service. Genghis Khan, though known for his ruthless military strategy, understood the importance of loyalty and competence in his warriors. Unlike many other empires where leaders were bound by bloodline and birthright, Genghis Khan believed that merit, skills, intelligence, and loyalty should be the true measure of a person's value. In this world, the rewards for proving yourself were significant. If you performed well in battle or showed exceptional skill in any area, Genghis Khan would reward you. These rewards were not just financial or material, though they were certainly present. The true reward lay in the power you could amass and the respect you could gain. The Mongols had a meritocratic system, meaning if you were a capable warrior, you could rise in the ranks regardless of your origins. You could find yourself leading a division of soldiers or managing key territories in the vast empire. This rise through the ranks gave warriors from humble backgrounds the opportunity to attain high positions and accumulate wealth, something that would have been nearly impossible in many other parts of the world at the time. For those who proved their loyalty and capability, the rewards were far-reaching. Genghis Khan's empire was vast, and as it expanded, opportunities for personal advancement were immense. If you were lucky or skilled enough to serve him well, you could find yourself entrusted with cities to govern, vast stretches of land to manage, or even armies to command. The Mongols didn't just conquer territories, they also built a system where loyal and skilled individuals could prosper, provided they maintained their usefulness to the empire. These rewards came quickly and were often accompanied by a sense of pride, being part of something greater than yourself, a force that was changing the face of the world. However, with such opportunities also came the harsh reality that failure or disobedience were dealt with swiftly and without mercy. If you failed in your duty, whether in battle or in loyalty, the consequences were severe. Genghis Khan was not a ruler who tolerated failure, and he made it clear that there was no room for error in his empire. If you lost a battle, failed to carry out an order, or betrayed the Mongol cause in any way, you would face the full wrath of his punishment. The Mongols were famous for their brutal retribution against those who failed them. If you were caught disobeying orders, deserting your post, or committing acts of betrayal, you would likely be executed. In fact, some of the Mongols' most notorious methods of punishment involved executions that were as swift as they were brutal. Traitors were often killed immediately, sometimes in front of their comrades, to set an example. For Genghis Khan, loyalty was everything, and disloyalty was something that could tear the fabric of the entire empire apart. This made life under his rule both a privilege and a dangerous proposition. You were constantly aware that a single mistake could mean your end. But perhaps the most unique and striking aspect of life under Genghis Khan was the way he treated those who were captured. Unlike other empires that might have enslaved or killed prisoners of war, the Mongols often took a more pragmatic approach. Many prisoners were spared, but they had to prove their worth to the empire. They could be brought into the fold, trained, and used for the benefit of the empire. If you were captured by the Mongols, your fate wasn't necessarily sealed, but it all depended on whether you could prove yourself useful to Genghis Khan's growing empire. This policy allowed the Mongols to incorporate many people into their military and administrative ranks, boosting the empire's strength even further. However, not all was fair play in the world of the Mongols. As harsh and demanding as life was for the warriors, it was even more difficult for the common people. If you were an ordinary citizen living under Genghis Khan's rule, life would have been incredibly tough. The Mongols were known for their harsh methods of maintaining control over the lands they conquered. Cities that resisted Mongol rule were often razed to the ground, and their inhabitants slaughtered. The Mongols had a reputation for being unforgiving conquerors, and their battles often left a wake of destruction behind them. You might be forced to live under the fear that a Mongol invasion could come at any time. If you were a common person caught up in one of these invasions, your life could be forever changed by the brutality of the Mongol warriors. But even in the darkest of times, Genghis Khan's empire offered opportunities. His policies of merit, his respect for capable individuals, and his vision for a united empire made the Mongol Empire one of the most powerful in history. The ability to rise based on ability, not birthright, gave ordinary people the chance to join the ranks of an empire that spanned from Asia to Europe. If you managed to survive the hardships, the rewards were often worth the sacrifices. So, what would your life look like if you were part of this empire? You could rise to the top, commanding armies and governing lands, or you could fall victim to the unforgiving consequences of failure. The Mongol Empire was a place of both incredible opportunity and immense danger. Your survival depended on your skill, your loyalty, and your ability to navigate the brutal realities of a world shaped by one of history's most ruthless rulers. Now that you've experienced the raw and relentless life under Genghis Khan's rule, let's step forward into the time after his death. What happens to the world when the greatest military leader of all time is no longer at the helm? How does the Mongol Empire, built on conquest, discipline, and loyalty, fare without its visionary leader? Genghis Khan's death in 1227 left a massive void in the Mongol Empire, which at the time was the largest contiguous empire the world had ever seen. His leadership and military genius had brought together disparate tribes and regions under a single banner, unifying an enormous area stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea. But after his passing, the empire was divided among his 4 sons, each tasked with overseeing a portion of the empire's vast territory. The Mongols, known for their loyalty and rigid adherence to Genghis Khan's rules, now faced a new challenge: how to maintain the empire's cohesion without the man who had bound them together. At first glance, the empire seemed unstoppable. The Mongol military continued to be one of the most powerful forces on earth, and the regions Genghis Khan had conquered were still firmly under Mongol control. However, things were not as unified as they appeared. The sons of Genghis Khan, despite their father's efforts to prepare them for leadership, were not able to completely replicate his genius. The unity that Genghis Khan had fostered began to erode, and with it, the empire's stability started to weaken. The vast Mongol Empire was split into 4 khanates: the Golden Horde, which controlled Russia and Eastern Europe; the Ilkhanate, which governed the Middle East; the Chagatai Khanate, which spanned Central Asia; and the Yuan dynasty in China. While these regions were still technically under the Mongol umbrella, they increasingly developed their own identities, and the centralized control that Genghis Khan had maintained slowly disappeared. As the Mongol Empire fragmented, the unity that had once made it so powerful began to fade. Instead of working together, the different khanates often found themselves in conflict. They were still bound by a common heritage and a shared loyalty to their father's memory, but the drive to expand the empire and maintain the same level of control faltered. The fragmentation made it easier for local powers and rival states to rise up, challenging Mongol rule in ways that Genghis Khan would have never allowed. You, as someone living within the Mongol Empire, might have felt this shift. The once immense power of the Mongols was starting to wane, and now, instead of a single, focused military force, you would witness different regions and tribes vying for dominance. There would still be a sense of pride in being Mongol, but the security and order that Genghis Khan had provided were slowly being replaced by disunity and internal strife. The fear that once kept enemies at bay would start to fade, replaced by the uncertainty of a fragmented empire. Despite these challenges, the legacy of Genghis Khan still loomed large. His vision for a united world was never entirely forgotten, and his descendants, particularly in the Yuan dynasty, worked to preserve his memory. The Mongols in China, for example, maintained a strong grip on power, and under the leadership of Kublai Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, they continued to rule China for several more generations. The Yuan dynasty would go on to become one of the most significant imperial powers in Asia, but even within the Yuan dynasty, the struggles for control and the remnants of Mongol fragmentation were clear. As time went on, the Mongol influence began to dwindle in some areas. The Ilkhanate in the Middle East and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia would eventually fade, with local rulers emerging to fill the power vacuum left by the Mongol leadership. But in other regions, particularly Russia and China, Mongol influence endured far longer than most would expect. The Mongols had left behind a lasting legacy, one that would continue to shape the politics, culture, and economies of these regions for centuries to come. However, it's important to remember that Genghis Khan's empire was never meant to last forever. His brilliance as a leader, his ability to unite such diverse people and lands, created an empire that was always in motion. When he died, the cracks began to show, and the once cohesive Mongol Empire fractured into competing parts. The great vision of Genghis Khan could not be easily replicated, and with each passing generation, the empire's unity slipped further away. As a member of this empire, you might find yourself facing a difficult question. In a world without Genghis Khan, what does loyalty mean? The very thing that had held the empire together, his unbreakable leadership and vision, was now gone. You would have to decide whether you still believed in the Mongol cause, whether you were willing to fight for a piece of this fractured world, or whether it was time to forge your own path in a changing world. The fear of the Mongols that once kept the world at bay was now tempered by uncertainty, and the empire that had dominated the known world seemed to be unraveling. Living in the aftermath of Genghis Khan's death would be a strange existence. On the one hand, you might be living in a world that still had some of the trappings of the Mongol Empire, its military might, its influence on trade, and its cultural legacy. But on the other hand, you would see the cracks in the system. The world that Genghis Khan had built was slowly being replaced by something else, a more fractured reality, and it would be up to the next generation of leaders to determine if the empire could be preserved or if the world would evolve into something new. Despite the fragmentation of Genghis Khan's empire after his death, one of the most lasting legacies of the Mongol rule lies in the cultural and economic exchanges that took place across the vast territories they conquered. Genghis Khan's vision wasn't just about military domination. He understood the importance of communication, trade, and cultural exchange in ensuring the longevity and prosperity of his empire. Even as the Mongol Empire fractured into separate khanates, the infrastructure, networks, and policies that Genghis Khan established continued to have a profound effect on the world. One of the key elements of Mongol rule was the protection and promotion of trade. The Mongols controlled vast swathes of territory, stretching from the Middle East to China, and they recognized the value of facilitating trade along the Silk Road, the ancient network of trade routes that connected the East and the West. This trade network became more secure and efficient under Mongol rule than ever before. Merchants and travelers, who once had to fear bandits or hostile forces along the way, now found themselves able to move relatively freely within Mongol-controlled territories. This led to a flourishing of commerce, not only in goods but also in ideas, technologies, and knowledge. If you were a merchant during the time of the Mongols, you would find that traveling across these regions became much safer. You'd be able to transport luxury goods such as silk, spices, and precious metals across vast distances, making the journey between China, Central Asia, and Europe far more accessible than ever. Mongol rulers maintained a postal system known as the yam, which allowed messages to be sent quickly across the empire, ensuring that trade and communication flowed smoothly. You might be one of the many merchants who took advantage of this thriving economy, carrying goods from one end of the empire to the other. But the Mongol legacy wasn't just economic, it was cultural too. Under Mongol rule, there was an increased exchange of ideas between East and West. The Mongols, by their very nature as a diverse empire, brought together a wide range of people, cultures, and religions. The Mongol Empire was home to a rich tapestry of belief systems, from Islam in the West to Buddhism in the East. Genghis Khan himself was open to various religions, believing that tolerance was key to maintaining peace and unity in his empire. As a result, religious diversity thrived under Mongol rule. Religious leaders and scholars were invited to Mongol courts, where they were often given positions of influence and the opportunity to spread their teachings. Christian missionaries, Muslim scholars, Buddhist monks, and Taoist philosophers all interacted in this globalized empire. If you were a religious figure or scholar at the time, you would have found that the Mongol Empire provided an environment where ideas could be exchanged freely. This created a melting pot of cultures and intellectual exchange, one that would have lasting effects on the development of science, art, and philosophy. The Mongols also encouraged the spread of knowledge in more practical ways. For instance, many Mongol rulers, particularly in the Yuan dynasty in China, welcomed technological innovations from the West. Gunpowder weapons, which the Mongols had used with devastating effectiveness, were spread through their empire, and the Mongols even adapted these weapons in their own way, refining their use in sieges. You might have found yourself witnessing firsthand how technological innovations from one part of the empire quickly spread to another. Perhaps most importantly, the Mongols helped to re-establish the flow of knowledge and technology between the East and the West. During the Middle Ages, Europe had become somewhat isolated from Asia, but under Mongol rule, this gap began to close. If you were a European merchant, traveler, or diplomat, you would have had greater access to Asian products, ideas, and knowledge than ever before. Figures like Marco Polo, who traveled from Venice to China, famously documented the incredible reach of Mongol rule and the interconnectedness of the world under their empire. However, While the Mongols encouraged cultural exchange, they also left behind a legacy of destruction. The Mongol invasions, especially in Central Asia and the Middle East, were brutal. Cities that resisted Mongol rule were often destroyed and their populations massacred. The famous city of Nishapur, for example, saw the deaths of hundreds of thousands as the Mongols swept through. As a member of these conquered regions, you would have experienced the full force of Mongol wrath if your city stood in their way. The Mongols' reputation for brutality and their willingness to use terror as a weapon left scars on the lands they conquered that would not heal for generations. Despite these devastations, the Mongol Empire's contributions to global trade and culture cannot be denied. Even though their empire began to fragment after Genghis Khan's death, the trade routes and cultural exchanges they initiated continued to shape the world long after the Mongols faded from the historical stage. The legacy of the Silk Road, which had been revitalized under Mongol rule, remained important for centuries to come. The global interconnectedness that the Mongols helped to establish laid the foundation for the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies that would come to define the modern world. As time passed and the Mongol Khanates weakened, the remnants of Mongol culture continued to live on. The Yuan dynasty in China, for example, would continue to be a dominant force in East Asia for several more centuries. Even as the Mongol Empire disintegrated, the world that Genghis Khan had created, one of cultural exchange, trade, and innovation, continued to thrive in new forms. The Mongols had left their mark on history, and their influence would shape the world long after their empire fell apart. If you were living in this world after Genghis Khan's death, you might find that the Mongol Empire was a shadow of its former self, but its cultural and economic contributions would remain significant. You'd experience a more interconnected world, where trade was easier and ideas flowed more freely across borders. Despite the decline of Mongol political power, their influence in shaping the global economy and culture was far-reaching and long-lasting. As we continue our exploration of the Mongol Empire, it's important to reflect on how this once mighty empire eventually began to decline after the death of Genghis Khan. The world he created, with its vast network of trade routes, diverse cultures, and military dominance, started to fracture in the years following his death. But how exactly did this happen, and what were the long-term consequences of the Mongol Empire's downfall? After Genghis Khan passed away in 1227, the empire was left in the hands of his sons and grandsons, who inherited vast territories spanning from the steppes of Mongolia to the plains of Europe. However, while they inherited an empire that was geographically enormous, they lacked the leadership and cohesion that Genghis Khan had so masterfully established. The Mongol Empire became a collection of competing khanates, regions governed by different branches of Genghis Khan's family, each with its own priorities and ambitions. One of the key factors that led to the decline of the Mongol Empire was the struggle for power among Genghis Khan's descendants. As strong as the empire had been under Genghis Khan's direct rule, it was built around his personal authority and vision. His death created a leadership vacuum that his sons and grandsons couldn't fill in the same way. While Genghis Khan had been able to keep the empire united through sheer force of personality and military success, his heirs lacked the same ability to inspire unity. This fragmentation weakened the Mongol Empire's central authority, and over time it began to splinter into different competing regions. The Mongol Empire was divided into four main khanates: the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Russia, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia. These khanates were each ruled by different branches of Genghis Khan's family, but despite their shared ancestry, the rulers often found themselves at odds with one another. Rather than working together as a unified force, the different khanates began to pursue their own goals, sometimes clashing with one another over territory and influence. In the Yuan dynasty, for example, the Mongol rulers continued to maintain power in China for several generations, but their control weakened over time. Internal rebellions and external pressures, including conflicts with the Chinese populace, gradually eroded the strength of the Mongol rule. By the mid-14th century, the Yuan dynasty was replaced by the Ming dynasty, and Mongol power in China was effectively ended. In the Ilkhanate, which controlled much of Persia and the surrounding regions, similar struggles occurred. After the death of the last strong Ilkhan ruler, the empire fragmented into smaller factions, weakening the central authority. In the Golden Horde, which ruled over much of Russia, the Mongols faced increasing resistance from local Russian princes, who eventually united to overthrow Mongol rule. The Chagatai Khanate, which controlled Central Asia, also experienced internal strife, with different factions competing for power. This lack of unity across the Khanates made it difficult for the Mongol Empire to maintain the cohesion and strength it had under Genghis Khan. By the 15th century, the once mighty Mongol Empire had largely fractured, with its various Khanates falling into decline or being absorbed into the territories of other empires. Yet despite the collapse of the political and military structure, the Mongols left a lasting impact on the world. The legacy of Genghis Khan and his empire can be seen in many ways, from the trade routes they established to the cultural exchange they facilitated. Even though the Mongols no longer held political power, the world they had shaped continued to evolve. The Silk Road, which had flourished under Mongol rule, remained a critical trade route connecting the East and West for centuries. Goods, technologies, and ideas continued to flow between Asia and Europe, and the Mongols' influence on global trade and culture endured long after the empire's fall. One of the most significant contributions of the Mongols was their ability to bring together different cultures and religions under one empire. Despite the brutality of their conquests, the Mongols were relatively tolerant when it came to religion. Genghis Khan himself had been open to various belief systems, and his empire reflected this diversity. This cultural tolerance allowed different groups to coexist and contributed to the exchange of knowledge between East and West. The Mongols helped to revive the flow of ideas across Eurasia, facilitating the transmission of technologies, scientific knowledge, and philosophical ideas that had been relatively isolated before their empire united much of the continent. For example, the Mongols were instrumental in spreading paper-making technology from China to the West. They also played a key role in the transmission of gunpowder and other military technologies across the empire. The Mongols' support of trade and intellectual exchange helped create an environment where these technologies could spread, ultimately changing the course of history in both Asia and Europe. While the Mongol Empire may have crumbled, its influence can still be felt today. The connections between East and West that the Mongols facilitated laid the groundwork for future exchanges of knowledge, goods, and culture. The Mongols' empire, for all its violence and destruction, was also a force for connectivity in the world. It was a bridge between different civilizations, helping to foster the development of the modern world. As you live in this post-Mongol world, you'd see the effects of the empire's rise and fall. The remnants of Mongol rule would still be evident in the culture, trade, and political systems of the regions they once controlled. You'd also feel the absence of the Mongol Empire's once unifying force as the fragmented Khanates struggled to maintain control in the face of internal and external pressures. Still, the Mongol legacy would endure, and the world they shaped would continue to evolve long after the fall of their empire. As the Mongol Empire splintered into separate Khanates following the death of Genghis Khan, its political and military cohesion began to fade. But despite the fragmentation, the lasting impact of Mongol rule was far from over. The cultural, economic, and technological exchanges initiated by the Mongols had a profound influence on the world, shaping the future of trade, science, and politics for centuries to come. Even in the wake of the empire's collapse, the foundations the Mongols laid continued to reverberate throughout history. The most significant legacy of the Mongol Empire, perhaps, was its revitalization of the Silk Road. Before the Mongols, trade between the East and West was often perilous and fragmented, with merchants and travelers facing constant threats from bandits, political instability, and border conflicts. The Mongols, however, changed all that. Under their rule, they established a secure network of trade routes that spanned from China to Europe, facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies on an unprecedented scale. If you were a merchant during this period, you would find that traveling the Silk Road was much safer than it had ever been before. Mongol-controlled territories offered relatively secure passage, and the famous Yam system, a postal and relay station network, allowed goods and messages to move quickly across vast distances. No longer would you have to fear being ambushed by raiders. The Mongol Empire's vast network of spies and messengers ensured that trade routes remained open and protected. The exchange of goods across the Silk Road boomed. Luxuries like silk, tea, and spices flowed westward, while gold, silver, and precious stones made their way eastward. But it wasn't just material goods that exchanged hands. Perhaps more importantly, the Mongol Empire facilitated the spread of knowledge and culture between the East and West. One of the most profound impacts of the Mongol Empire was its role in the transfer of technological knowledge. The Mongols were instrumental in transmitting Chinese innovations to the West, including papermaking, gunpowder, and printing technologies. If you were a European scholar or inventor during the 13th or 14th century, you might have found that these once isolated technologies were now within your reach, thanks to the connections fostered by Mongol rule. These innovations, which would go on to change the course of history, were spread rapidly across Eurasia, changing the political and military landscapes of both Asia and Europe. Gunpowder, for instance, which had been developed in China, was passed along the trade routes and into the hands of European nations, ultimately transforming warfare on a global scale. The Mongols, masters of gunpowder artillery, used this technology with devastating effect in their sieges and battles. The knowledge of how to use gunpowder spread quickly throughout the empire, and before long, European armies were using it as well. This technological exchange had far-reaching consequences, shaping the course of military history for centuries. The Mongols also played a significant role in the spread of the printing press. By introducing the art of printing to the West, they opened the doors for the mass production of books, which eventually led to the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. If you were a scholar during this time, you would have witnessed a cultural and intellectual explosion, fueled by the exchange of ideas that the Mongols facilitated. Scholars from all over the world began to correspond and share knowledge, creating a global network of intellectuals that had never existed before. In addition to technological advancements, the Mongols also played a crucial role in the exchange of ideas. Religion, philosophy, and science all traveled freely across the vast Mongol Empire. Genghis Khan himself was known for his religious tolerance, allowing various belief systems to coexist within his empire. Islam, Buddhism, Christianity, and even Taoism found their place in the Mongol world, and religious scholars of all kinds interacted with one another, exchanging ideas and practices. If you lived in the Mongol Empire, you would have witnessed a unique blending of cultures and religions, with Mongol rulers allowing these traditions to thrive side by side. Even though the Mongol Empire eventually fractured, these cultural exchanges continued to shape the future of Eurasia. The intellectual and scientific knowledge that had been exchanged between East and West continued to benefit both regions long after the empire's decline. The Mongols may have lost control of their vast empire, but the networks they built, the roads they established, and the cultural exchanges they initiated left a lasting imprint on history. As time went on, the Mongol Khanates weakened, and the great empire fragmented into smaller political entities. The Yuan dynasty in China fell, the Ilkhanate in Persia disintegrated, and the Golden Horde lost its power in Russia. However, even as the Mongol political structures crumbled, their influence remained strong, particularly in the regions they had once controlled. If you were a resident of one of these regions, you would feel the lasting impact of Mongol rule in many aspects of your life. The trade routes they established would remain vital, allowing goods and ideas to continue flowing between East and West. The influence of Mongol art, architecture, and military strategy would continue to be felt, shaping the development of the cultures that had once been part of their empire. In Russia, for example, although the Mongols had lost their political control, the legacy of Mongol rule still persisted in the way the Russian state was organized. The centralized bureaucracy that the Mongols had established in their territories influenced the future development of Russia. Similarly, in China, the Mongol influence continued under the Ming dynasty, as the foundations of Mongol rule were built upon in the centuries that followed. Even in the regions where Mongol power had diminished, their legacy was far from forgotten. The Mongols had forever altered the course of world history, and the exchange of knowledge, goods, and ideas that they had fostered would continue to shape global civilizations long after their empire had faded. So, how would life feel after the Mongol Empire's collapse? For those who lived through it, the changes would have been profound. The empire's disintegration left a fractured world, but one that was deeply interconnected. The trade routes remained active, ideas continued to flow, and the technological and cultural advancements initiated by the Mongols helped to lay the foundation for the modern world. Even though the Mongol Empire eventually fragmented into separate Khanates and the once vast empire began to unravel, the legacy of Genghis Khan and his descendants continues to shape the modern world in ways that are still often overlooked. The Mongols' achievements, cultural, military, and economic, left an indelible mark on history, even though their political rule has long since ended. In the years following the fall of the Mongol Empire, the territories they once controlled continued to be shaped by the legacy they left behind. The economic and cultural systems they established remained in place for centuries, influencing the development of the modern world in ways that are still felt today. The Mongols were instrumental in creating a more interconnected world, one where trade, technology, and knowledge could travel freely between East and West. The Silk Road, which had flourished under Mongol rule, continued to serve as a major conduit for goods, ideas, and people for hundreds of years after the Mongols had lost their grip on power. If you were living in the centuries after the collapse of the Mongol Empire, you would still see the effects of Mongol rule in your daily life. For one, the idea of a globalized trade network that connected the East and West had become a permanent feature of the world economy. The Mongols were the first to truly bring together the economies of Eurasia, and their influence helped to create a foundation for global trade that would expand and flourish in the centuries to come. The trade routes they controlled became key to the exchange of goods like silk, spices, and precious metals, and the global demand for these goods continued to grow well into the age of exploration and beyond. But the Mongols didn't just leave behind material wealth and trade routes, they also left behind a cultural legacy that continued to shape the world. The openness to different cultures, religions, and philosophies that Genghis Khan fostered within his empire helped to create a more cosmopolitan world. If you were living in this time, you would likely experience a society that was more tolerant of religious and cultural diversity than it had been before. The Mongols had promoted the idea that all religions and cultures were worthy of respect, and their example encouraged the exchange of ideas across borders. Even in areas where Mongol rule had been particularly brutal, such as Central Asia and the Middle East, the influence of Mongol governance continued to linger. The administrative systems they had introduced were adopted by many of the states that succeeded them, and the Mongol emphasis on meritocracy, military discipline, and strategic thinking continued to influence political structures and leadership practices in these regions. The Mongols also contributed to the spread of technologies that would go on to shape the modern world. The most notable of these was the dissemination of gunpowder, a technology that had been developed in China and was spread westward by the Mongols. Gunpowder, which had been used by the Mongols with devastating effect in battle, eventually revolutionized warfare in both the East and the West. If you were a European military strategist or inventor, you would see how the use of gunpowder changed the way wars were fought, from the development of cannons to firearms. This had a profound impact on the way empires waged war, and it fundamentally altered the balance of power in the world. The Mongols also played a key role in spreading paper-making technology, which in turn helped to facilitate the spread of knowledge across the globe. The Mongols introduced the art of paper-making to the West, and this technology would later play a significant role in the European Renaissance and the scientific revolution. Without the Mongol Empire's role in facilitating the spread of paper and printing technology, the intellectual and cultural explosion of the Renaissance might not have occurred as it did. For scholars, writers, and thinkers, the availability of paper allowed for the mass production of books and texts, making knowledge more accessible than ever before. Perhaps one of the most enduring aspects of the Mongol legacy is the impact they had on the world's perception of leadership and governance. Genghis Khan's ability to unite disparate tribes, create a meritocratic society, and build one of the largest empires in history remains an example of how strong leadership and a clear vision can transform the course of history. The Mongols' emphasis on loyalty, discipline, and adaptability would influence political leaders and military commanders for generations. If you were a ruler or military strategist, you would likely study Genghis Khan's tactics and leadership principles, using them to shape your own strategies and methods of governance. Even today, the world is still shaped by the Mongol legacy. In places like Mongolia, the memory of Genghis Khan is honored and celebrated. His influence continues to be felt in the culture, politics, and identity of the Mongolian people. Genghis Khan is not just a historical figure to the Mongols, he is a symbol of national pride and strength. His image is used in everything from statues and monuments to modern media and art, reflecting his enduring significance to the Mongolian people. Outside of Mongolia, the Mongol Empire's impact can be seen in the political and cultural developments of countries that were once part of the empire. From Russia to China to Persia, the legacy of Mongol rule is still a part of the historical fabric of these nations. Whether through the administrative practices they left behind, the cultural exchanges they facilitated, or the military strategies they employed, the Mongols continue to influence the world today. In conclusion, the Mongol Empire, though long gone, left an indelible mark on the course of world history. Genghis Khan's vision of a united empire and his ability to bring together such a vast and diverse array of people, cultures, and territories remains one of the most significant achievements in human history. Even after the empire's collapse, the global interconnectedness it helped create continued to shape the world for centuries. If you were living in the centuries that followed the Mongol Empire's downfall, you would still feel the ripple effects of their rise and fall. The empire may have crumbled, but its legacy lives on, continuing to influence and shape the world in ways that are still felt today. As we've seen, the Mongol Empire's fragmentation after the death of Genghis Khan set the stage for a period of political instability and shifting power dynamics. While the Mongol Empire itself fell into decline, its remnants continued to affect the geopolitical landscape of Eurasia, even as new powers began to rise and fill the void left by the once mighty empire. In this part, we'll explore the fall of the Mongol Empire, the eventual rise of new powers, and the impact of Mongol governance on the changing world order. When Genghis Khan passed away, the Mongol Empire, though vast, became more fragmented as his descendants struggled to maintain unity. Genghis Khan had established a system of government that was both innovative and brutally effective, but after his death, his sons and grandsons struggled to uphold his vision. His empire was divided into 4 main khanates, each governed by different branches of his family. These khanates, the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Russia, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia were all technically part of the Mongol Empire, but the lack of strong centralized leadership led to their eventual disintegration. The decline of the Mongol Empire was accelerated by internal conflicts among Genghis Khan's heirs, each vying for more power and control. Rivalries between the different khanates grew, and as their military and administrative unity weakened, so too did their ability to resist external pressures. Mongol rule, once a source of fear and dominance, began to crumble as local populations and rising powers took advantage of the empire's weakening grip. One of the most significant events that contributed to the Mongol Empire's downfall was the collapse of the Yuan dynasty in China. The Mongols had ruled China for nearly a century, but by the late 14th century, they faced increasing resistance from the Chinese population. The Yuan dynasty, led by Kublai Khan and his successors, struggled with corruption, rebellion, and the inability to effectively govern the vast and diverse territories of China. The Mongols' loss of control over China marked the end of Mongol dominance in the region, and the rise of the Ming dynasty, which replaced the Yuan dynasty, began a new chapter in Chinese history. In Persia, the Ilkhanate also struggled to maintain unity after Genghis Khan's death. While the Ilkhanate had once been a powerful and prosperous region, it too was plagued by internal conflicts and was weakened by the death of key leaders. The collapse of the Ilkhanate allowed local powers to reassert control, and by the early 14th century, the once great Mongol Khanate had fragmented into smaller, independent kingdoms. The rise of the Timurids, led by the legendary Timur Tamerlane, was one of the key events that followed the Ilkhanate's fall. Timur, a Turkic-Mongol conqueror, sought to revive the Mongol Empire in some ways, but his efforts were ultimately short-lived, and he did not manage to restore the unity that Genghis Khan had established. Meanwhile, in the Russian territories, the Mongol Golden Horde continued to exert influence for several centuries after Genghis Khan's death. The Golden Horde, which had controlled much of Russia, gradually lost power as local Russian princes began to assert their independence. By the 15th century, the Grand Duchy of Moscow, under the leadership of Ivan III, rose to prominence and eventually expelled the Mongols from Russia. This marked the beginning of the rise of the Russian Empire, which would go on to become a major power in Eastern Europe and beyond. The Chagatai Khanate, which controlled Central Asia, faced similar issues of fragmentation. After Genghis Khan's death, the Chagatai Khanate was divided, and internal strife weakened its ability to maintain control over the vast region. This instability eventually allowed the rise of powerful local rulers such as the Uzbek Khanate, who took control of parts of Central Asia. As the Mongol Empire fragmented, new powers began to emerge across the regions once controlled by the Mongols. In China, the Ming dynasty restored native Chinese rule, pushing out the Mongols and instituting a new era of governance. In Russia, the rise of the Grand Duchy of Moscow signaled the beginning of Russian independence from Mongol control, and the Russian Empire began its long expansion. In Central Asia, local kingdoms rose to prominence, shaping the future of the region. Even in Persia, the Timurids and other regional powers built on the legacy of the Mongols to establish new empires and dynasties. While the Mongols were no longer the dominant force they once had been, their legacy remained. The political structures they introduced, such as centralized governance and a meritocratic military system, influenced many of the new powers that rose in the aftermath of their fall. The administrative systems they built, their approach to religious tolerance, and their efforts to integrate various cultures and peoples into one unified empire left a lasting impression on the regions they had once ruled. In Russia, for example, the Mongol system of local administration and tribute paying became a model for future Russian rulers. The Mongol influence can also be seen in the Russian military system, where the Mongols' use of cavalry, fast-moving forces, and siege tactics were incorporated into Russian warfare. Similarly, The rise of the Ming dynasty in China was shaped by the experience of Mongol rule. The Ming emperors sought to restore traditional Chinese values and practices, but they also adopted many of the administrative and military practices that had been introduced by the Mongols. The Mongol experience also influenced the development of China's foreign relations, as the Ming dynasty looked to build on the Mongol legacy of international trade and diplomacy. Even though the Mongol Empire no longer existed in its former glory, the idea of a vast, interconnected world of trade, culture, and ideas lived on. The Silk Road, which the Mongols had revitalized, continued to be an important conduit for exchange. The cultural and technological exchanges initiated by the Mongols continued to shape the course of history, as innovations like gunpowder and printing spread westward and had a lasting impact on European history. So, how did the fall of the Mongol Empire change the world? While it marked the end of one of the largest and most powerful empires in history, it also set the stage for new powers to emerge. The collapse of Mongol rule allowed for the rise of independent states and empires, each building on the Mongol legacy in their own way. The political fragmentation left a void that was filled by new powers like the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Ming dynasty. Though the Mongols themselves no longer ruled the world, their influence continued to shape the course of history for centuries to come. In the centuries following the collapse of the Mongol Empire, the world underwent vast changes, with new powers rising to fill the vacuum left behind. While the Mongols themselves faded from the political spotlight, the contributions they made to global trade, cultural exchange, and the very structure of empires continued to be felt. If you lived through this transition, you would have witnessed how the collapse of one empire gave way to the birth of several others, each drawing inspiration from the Mongol model in some way. But what exactly were the lasting contributions of the Mongols, and how did they shape the trajectory of world history? One of the most significant contributions of the Mongol Empire was its revitalization of the Silk Road, the ancient network of trade routes that connected the East to the West. This trade route, which had existed for centuries, had fallen into disrepair due to political fragmentation, piracy, and instability. Under Mongol rule, however, the Silk Road flourished once more. The Mongols brought order and stability to the region, enabling trade to flow more freely between the Far East, the Middle East, and Europe. If you were a trader living during this time, you would have experienced firsthand the prosperity that came from increased access to goods, spices, silk, and technologies from across the world. The Mongols' control over these trade routes also helped to facilitate the exchange of ideas. This wasn't just a one-way flow of goods, it was a transfer of knowledge, art, and culture that would have lasting implications. The Mongols were instrumental in spreading technologies like papermaking and printing from China to the West. They also played a key role in introducing gunpowder to Europe, forever altering the course of military history. You would have likely seen the first stirrings of the Renaissance, as ideas and innovations that had been hidden in the East began to make their way westward. Religious tolerance, a core tenet of Mongol rule, was another significant legacy of the empire. Genghis Khan himself was known for his belief that all religions were valid, and he encouraged the practice of various belief systems within his empire. Whether you were a Muslim, a Buddhist, a Christian, or even a shamanist, under Mongol rule, your beliefs were respected. This level of religious tolerance was rare during that time, and it had far-reaching consequences for the development of multicultural societies in the regions the Mongols controlled. This tradition of religious tolerance continued to influence the culture and governance of various regions even after the fall of the empire, fostering a more diverse and cosmopolitan world. Furthermore, the Mongol system of governance, though often brutal, also introduced a level of meritocracy and efficiency that would be replicated by later empires. Genghis Khan and his descendants employed a form of rule that valued skill and loyalty over birthright. This allowed for the rise of competent officials and military commanders from all walks of life, which set the stage for future systems of governance. If you lived in the centuries after the fall of the Mongols, you would have seen similar structures emerge in the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and even in the Ming Dynasty in China. However, despite these contributions, the Mongols also left behind a legacy of destruction. Their conquests were often marked by widespread devastation and slaughter. Many cities, particularly in the Middle East and Central Asia, were completely destroyed during the Mongol invasions and their populations decimated. While some cities recovered, many never regained their former grandeur. If you were living in one of these regions, you would have felt the aftermath of the Mongol invasions for generations, both in the physical destruction of the cities and the psychological trauma that came with it. But the paradox of the Mongol Empire is that despite the brutality, the empire's collapse did not mean the end of their influence. If you lived in the 14th or 15th centuries, you would have seen the world slowly starting to rebuild from the ashes of the Mongol conquests. Even though the Mongols were no longer in power, their legacy lived on in the systems they had established, the trade routes they had revitalized, and the cultural exchanges they had facilitated. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Mongol legacy was how it helped to connect disparate parts of the world. Before their empire, the East and the West were largely isolated from one another, with little interaction between the great civilizations of China, India, the Middle East, and Europe. The Mongol Empire, though short-lived, bridged this gap, making it possible for goods, ideas, and people to travel freely across vast distances. If you were living in Europe at the time, the Mongols' revival of the Silk Road would have given you access to goods and knowledge that had previously been out of reach. Similarly, if you were in China, the Mongols' influence helped to create greater ties with the West, encouraging trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. As the centuries passed, the world began to recover from the Mongol invasions, and the political entities that rose in the aftermath of Mongol rule, such as the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Mughal Empire, would continue many of the practices that the Mongols had introduced. These empires carried forward the legacy of a world more interconnected than ever before, where trade and culture flowed freely between East and West, and where ideas and technologies spread rapidly. Even as the Mongol Empire faded into history, its influence endured. The world that Genghis Khan had envisioned, a world where cultures and ideas could cross boundaries and where power was earned, not inherited, continued to shape the course of human history. The Mongols were not just conquerors, they were agents of change, reshaping the world in ways that would last for centuries. So as you look back at the rise and fall of the Mongol Empire, you see a story of brutality and brilliance, destruction and creation. The Mongols may have been a people of war, but they were also a people of transformation. In their brief reign, they changed the course of history in ways that would echo through time, creating a legacy that would continue to influence the world long after their empire crumbled. Although the Mongol Empire eventually collapsed and fragmented into several smaller khanates, its impact on the world didn't vanish with it. The Mongols were often seen as ruthless conquerors, leaving a trail of devastation in their wake, but their influence was far-reaching and in many ways transformative. Their ability to connect diverse cultures, foster trade, and facilitate the exchange of ideas laid the groundwork for the modern world as we know it today. As we've seen in previous parts of this narrative, the Mongols were key players in re-establishing the Silk Road, one of the most important trade routes in history. Their rule allowed for the free movement of goods between the East and West, which in turn facilitated a cultural and intellectual exchange that hadn't been seen in centuries. But it wasn't just the immediate material wealth from this trade that shaped the future. It was the long-term effects of the connections the Mongols built between civilizations. If you were living in Europe during or after Mongol rule, you would have experienced firsthand the arrival of new ideas and technologies that had been cultivated in the East. One of the most significant contributions the Mongols made to European society was the transmission of gunpowder technology. Gunpowder, which originated in China, had been used by the Mongols in their devastating sieges and battles. Through their vast empire and their expansion westward, the Mongols were instrumental in spreading this new and revolutionary technology across Eurasia. The use of gunpowder in warfare would go on to revolutionize European military strategies and eventually lead to the development of firearms and cannons, changing the landscape of warfare for centuries to come. But the Mongols didn't just spread gunpowder, they also facilitated the spread of other technologies, such as papermaking and the printing press. These inventions, which had first developed in China, made their way to the West through the Mongols. By introducing these technologies to Europe, the Mongols set the stage for the European Renaissance and the eventual spread of knowledge that would lead to the Enlightenment and beyond. If you were a scholar or artist during the Renaissance, you would have used the technologies that the Mongols helped to spread, such as printing, to distribute your work and ideas to a much wider audience than ever before. On the other side of the world, in China, the end of the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty brought a return to native Chinese rule under the Ming dynasty. However, the cultural and political legacy of the Mongols endured. The Mongols had introduced a centralized system of government that focused on merit and efficiency. The Ming dynasty, though it sought to distance itself from Mongol rule, retained many of the administrative practices and structures established by the Mongols. The Mongols had also facilitated a greater connection between China and the rest of the world, particularly through maritime trade. This expansion of global trade routes helped China become a global economic powerhouse in the centuries that followed. In the Middle East, the Mongols had similarly left their mark, though their conquest was often violent and destructive. The Ilkhanate, a Mongol Khanate in Persia, eventually fell, but the influence of the Mongol rulers on the region's political and military systems remained. The Mongols helped to revive trade between the East and the West, and even after their departure, the economic ties they fostered would continue to shape the political landscape of the region. In Russia, the Mongol Empire's influence lasted far longer than many realize. The Golden Horde, the Mongol state that ruled over much of Russia, played a key role in shaping the early Russian state. While the Mongols were eventually driven out by the Grand Duchy of Moscow, the administrative systems they left behind had a lasting effect on Russian governance. If you were living in Russia in the 15th century, you would have seen how the Mongols' method of tribute and centralized control helped shape the development of the Russian Empire. Even though the Mongols lost their political power, their cultural and military influence continued to be felt in many parts of the world. The Mongol approach to warfare, particularly their use of cavalry and mobile armies, continued to inspire military tactics long after their empire had collapsed. The Mongols' ability to quickly mobilize their forces and adapt to changing conditions on the battlefield set a standard for military strategy that would be studied and emulated for centuries. But beyond the military and technological innovations, the Mongols also had a significant impact on the world's view of governance. Genghis Khan's meritocratic approach to leadership, where ability and loyalty were valued over lineage or birthright, set a precedent for future rulers. If you were a ruler or politician in the centuries after the Mongol Empire's decline, you might have been influenced by Genghis Khan's emphasis on rewarding talent and competence rather than simply favoring aristocracy or nobility. This system of meritocracy would eventually play a significant role in the development of modern states and institutions. If you were to look at the world today, you'd see the enduring influence of the Mongols in a number of ways. The trade routes they revived, the cultural exchanges they fostered, and the political systems they helped establish all continue to shape the modern world. From the spread of technologies like gunpowder and printing to the establishment of global trade networks that paved the way for the modern economy, the Mongol Empire's legacy is still very much present. Even in the countries that were once part of the Mongol Empire, their influence is still visible in the cultures, politics, and economies. Mongolia, for instance, proudly maintains its historical ties to Genghis Khan and celebrates his legacy as a national hero. In China, Russia, and the Middle East, the Mongol impact can still be seen in everything from architecture to military tactics. While the Mongol Empire itself may have crumbled, its legacy has proven to be remarkably resilient. The world that Genghis Khan built, with its unprecedented levels of connectivity and exchange, laid the foundations for much of the world's modern political, economic, and cultural systems. The Mongols may no longer rule the world, but their influence is still felt in the very fabric of the societies they helped shape. Though the Mongol Empire itself no longer exists, the lasting influence of Genghis Khan and his successors continues to resonate in today's globalized world. The Mongols, in their brief but intense rule, forever altered the course of world history. While the political structure they built may have collapsed, their cultural, economic, and technological contributions provided the foundation for the modern world we know today. In this part, we'll explore how the legacy of Genghis Khan continues to influence the world in ways that are still relevant, even in the 21st century. 1. The Mongol legacy in global trade networks. One of the most profound impacts of the Mongol Empire was its role in connecting the East and West. Under Genghis Khan's leadership, the Mongols brought unprecedented stability to the Silk Road, allowing for the movement of goods, ideas, and technologies between Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Even after the empire fragmented, the trade routes remained active and were crucial for the flow of commodities like silk, spices, and other luxury goods. In modern times, the legacy of the Mongols can still be seen in the global trade networks that continue to connect the world. The Silk Road may no longer exist in its original form, but the idea of a global trading system where goods and services can be exchanged across vast distances remains a cornerstone of today's economy. Whether through international shipping routes, digital commerce, or financial networks, the Mongols' emphasis on fostering global trade is still felt in the global supply chains that dominate the modern world. If you were a business owner today, you'd be living in a world where the ease of international trade, made possible by the Mongols, allows you to connect with customers and suppliers from virtually any part of the world. The infrastructure, systems, and ideas that were fostered during Mongol rule continue to power the global economy. 2. The Mongol influence on governance and administration. Genghis Khan was a revolutionary leader, not only in terms of military prowess, but also in the way he governed his empire. He established a meritocratic system that valued skill, loyalty, and intelligence over birthright. Under his rule, individuals were promoted based on their abilities, and the Mongols developed an efficient, highly organized government system. Genghis Khan's ability to unify such a vast, diverse empire and govern it effectively set the foundation for future administrations around the world. In the centuries following the fall of the Mongol Empire, this system of meritocracy would influence the development of various global empires and nations. The idea that governance should be based on ability, not aristocratic birth, can be seen in modern political systems where civil service exams and the promotion of individuals based on merit have become widespread. Countries like China, Russia, and even Western democracies have adopted similar administrative models that stem from the Mongol example. If you were living in the 21st century, you might look at the current global trend toward meritocratic institutions and recognize the Mongol influence in these systems. Governments and corporations across the world continue to value competence and loyalty over traditional systems of power which Genghis Khan pioneered on a global scale. 3. The spread of ideas, religion, and knowledge. Another critical area where the Mongols left a lasting legacy is in their role as facilitators of cultural and intellectual exchange. Under Genghis Khan, the Mongols not only tolerated a variety of religions but encouraged the exchange of ideas. This openness to cultural and religious diversity allowed for an unprecedented flow of knowledge between East and West, especially in areas such as science, medicine, and technology. The Mongols' support of religious tolerance enabled the peaceful coexistence of various faiths, from Islam to Christianity to Buddhism. They welcomed scholars and intellectuals from all over the world, which allowed for the sharing of ideas and innovations that would later shape the development of civilization. If you were living in a multicultural society today, you would see that the values of tolerance, intellectual exchange, and the free flow of ideas are essential to creating a progressive, open society, a legacy that can be traced back to the Mongol Empire. In terms of knowledge, the Mongols also helped facilitate the spread of Chinese inventions such as paper, printing, and gunpowder to the West. These technologies eventually transformed Europe's approach to warfare, communication, and knowledge production. The modern world's reliance on paper for communication and publishing, and the widespread use of gunpowder, can be traced back to the exchanges initiated by the Mongols. 4. The Mongol military influence on modern warfare. One of the more direct legacies of the Mongol Empire is their impact on the evolution of military strategy. The Mongols were unparalleled in their use of cavalry, speed, and precision. They perfected the art of mounted archery and developed military tactics that were ahead of their time, such as feigned retreats and ambushes. These tactics were so effective that they continued to be studied and emulated for centuries after the Mongols' empire fell. The Mongols' ability to move quickly and efficiently across large distances using a combination of speed and surprise influenced military leaders and tactics for generations. Even in the modern era, many military organizations study the Mongol strategies in order to understand how to wage successful guerrilla warfare, long-range military operations, and high-mobility tactics. If you were in the military today, you would recognize how the Mongols' tactics are still relevant, particularly in modern asymmetrical warfare, where small, fast-moving forces rely on the element of surprise and hit-and-run tactics. 5. The cultural impact of Genghis Khan's legacy. Beyond trade, governance, and warfare, the Mongol Empire's legacy also extended to art and culture. Mongol rule influenced artistic traditions across the world, from the illuminated manuscripts of Europe to the development of Islamic art. The Mongols acted as patrons of art and architecture, commissioning works from artists across Eurasia, and helped foster the exchange of artistic techniques. Their influence on culture wasn't just limited to their empire, it also spread to other regions they came in contact with, influencing various artistic and architectural movements across the world. Today, you might see echoes of this influence in the art, architecture, and design that mixes Eastern and Western styles. Mongol-inspired design elements are visible in the architecture of regions once under their control, and you can trace their artistic influence through the centuries. The Mongols, by encouraging cultural exchange, left behind a legacy of beauty, craftsmanship, and innovation. In conclusion, the enduring Mongol influence. The Mongol Empire, for all its brutality and conquest, left behind a legacy that profoundly shaped the world. From global trade networks to cultural exchanges, from governance systems to military tactics, the impact of the Mongols is still visible today. Their influence is embedded in the fabric of the modern world, whether it's in the multicultural societies we live in, the technologies we use, or the strategies we employ in warfare and governance. While the empire itself may have fallen, the Mongol legacy continues to shape the way we connect, govern, fight, and create. Genghis Khan's vision of a united world, built on merit and cultural exchange, still resonates in the globalized society we live in today. As we reach the final chapter in the story of the Mongol Empire, it's important to reflect on the enduring power of its legacy. While the Mongol Empire itself has long since faded, the impact of Genghis Khan and his successors continues to resonate throughout history. The fragmentation of the empire and the eventual loss of Mongol control in most of their territories were inevitable consequences of the challenges they faced after Genghis Khan's death. However, the forces they set into motion, military, cultural, and economic, have had a lasting influence on the world we live in today. The empire fractures, but its influence remains. As we've explored, the Mongol Empire began to crumble soon after Genghis Khan's death. Despite his best efforts to prepare his sons and grandsons to govern, internal conflicts, regional ambitions, and the overwhelming size of the empire proved too much to maintain unity. The empire fractured into 4 distinct khanates, each led by a member of Genghis Khan's family. From that point forward, the Mongols were no longer a unified force. They were divided by internal strife, with different khanates pursuing their own agendas. Yet, despite this division, the Mongols left behind a world forever altered by their presence. The Silk Road, once a dangerous and fragmented route, became an avenue for commerce and cultural exchange, with the Mongols at the center of this revitalization. Trade between East and West flourished, and the exchange of goods, technologies, and ideas became more efficient and widespread than ever before. The Mongols were responsible for linking civilizations that had been separated for centuries, allowing knowledge and innovations to flow more freely across the globe. The Mongols and the rise of new empires. Although the Mongol Empire fell apart, the remnants of Mongol rule set the stage for the rise of new powers. In Russia, the Mongol rule had a lasting impact on governance and military strategy, influencing the rise of the Grand Duchy of Moscow. The Mongols' practice of centralized control and their reliance on cavalry tactics were adopted by Russian rulers, and these practices contributed to the formation of the Russian Empire. In China, the Yuan dynasty, which had been founded by Kublai Khan, fell to the Ming dynasty in the mid-14th century. However, the Mongol presence in China helped to lay the foundation for China's global power in later centuries. The Mongols had built infrastructure, established trade routes, and promoted contact with other cultures, all of which helped to position China as a global player long after Mongol rule had ended. The Ilkhanate in Persia also had a lasting impact. While it fragmented after the death of its ruler, the Ilkhans helped to revive trade and cultural exchange between the East and West. This continued influence can still be felt in the region today, where the Mongol legacy endures in the form of cultural and architectural landmarks. The Mongol impact on military strategy. Perhaps one of the most enduring legacies of the Mongols is their military prowess. The Mongol army under Genghis Khan was one of the most formidable forces ever assembled. Their ability to rapidly mobilize, adapt to different terrains, and employ innovative tactics like feigned retreats and psychological warfare set them apart from their contemporaries. Even today, military strategists study the Mongol methods of warfare. Their use of cavalry, intelligence networks, and surprise attacks have been incorporated into modern military tactics. The Mongols' ability to outmaneuver and outthink their opponents remains a powerful lesson in the importance of flexibility, speed, and adaptability in military strategy. Cultural and technological exchange. The Mongol Empire was also a catalyst for cultural and technological exchange. The Mongols helped to spread knowledge between East and West, facilitating the exchange of ideas, art, and science. Papermaking, gunpowder, and printing technology all traveled from China to the West, dramatically changing European society. In addition to these technological innovations, the Mongols' support for various religions and cultures helped to foster an environment of intellectual exchange. Genghis Khan's tolerance of different belief systems, whether they were Islam, Buddhism, Christianity, or traditional shamanism, encouraged the sharing of ideas across cultural boundaries. This cultural exchange, combined with the relative peace and security provided by Mongol rule, allowed scholars, scientists, and artists from different parts of the world to interact in unprecedented ways. The impact of this cultural exchange can still be seen today in the diverse and interconnected world we live in. The spread of scientific knowledge, artistic techniques, and religious ideas from the Mongol Empire helped shape the global civilization we are part of today. Whether it's the movement of artistic styles from Asia to Europe, the transmission of scientific knowledge, or the continued dialogue between different cultures, the Mongol Empire left behind a legacy of intellectual and cultural exchange that continues to benefit humanity, a reflection on the Mongol legacy. As we conclude our exploration of the Mongol Empire, it's clear that while the empire itself has long since vanished, its influence has endured. The Mongols' contributions to trade, governance, military strategy, cultural exchange, and technological innovation have had a lasting impact on the world. Even though the empire fragmented and eventually faded, the connections they made between civilizations continue to shape our world today. If you were living in the centuries after the fall of the Mongol Empire, you would witness the world gradually recovering from the destruction caused by the Mongols. Yet even as new empires rose and old ones fell, the legacy of Genghis Khan and his successors remained deeply embedded in the fabric of global history. The world that the Mongols helped to create, with its interconnected trade routes, intellectual exchanges, and technological advancements, laid the foundation for the modern world. The Mongols may no longer control vast empires or military forces, but their imprint on history is undeniable. In many ways, they were ahead of their time, visionaries who understood the importance of cultural exchange, trade, and unity in a way that few others did. Genghis Khan's empire may have crumbled, but the world he helped shape continues to thrive, a testament to the lasting power of his legacy. And so, we've journeyed through the highs and lows of the Mongol Empire, a saga that spanned from fierce battles to peaceful days of cultural exchange. Life under Genghis Khan's rule was tough, demanding, but also filled with valuable lessons in resilience, strategy, and loyalty. But now we pause. The great Mongol Empire, as mighty as it was, eventually fractured, giving way to new powers. Yet even as that colossal empire crumbled, the marks it left on human civilization remain. The trade routes they opened, the military strategies that others still learn from, and the values of connection and cultural exchange, they all continue to live on, transcending time. Now, as the world has evolved and moved into a new era, the image of those Mongol warriors with their speed and resolve in every stride may fade. But what they left behind, the roads they paved, the bridges they built between cultures, will always endure, quietly shaping this world we live in today. So, as you let the day end and the quiet of the night wrap around you, allow those ancient images to soften, slowly fading away. Let them make room for the peaceful rhythm of your thoughts as your breath deepens, your pace slows, and rest draws near. Turn off the lights now, let the calm settle in. The world they built may have dissolved into the past, but the legacy they forged continues, ever so gently. Good night.